Transspecies plasticity in Nora. According to the British Medical Journal, 1924, a monkey graft was a return, as it were, to our ancestry for refreshment. Within such a return to the evolutionary source of vital plasticity was the potential for a dizzying reversal. What if, in the process, we became more ape than human? Was sex powered by an ape testicle interspecies sex? If the vitality of the ape was so desirable, so erotic, then might apes simply be superior to humans? Was the human species, unlike apes, weakened by generations of straying too far from our nature? Such disquieting doubts are given full sway in Champsor's 1929 popular science fiction novel, Nora, La Guignol Devenue Femme, translated into English in 2015 as Nora, the Ape Woman. Nora compares three sets of xenotransplant recipients. Ernest Paris is an aging French littérateur who undergoes a monkey gland transplant to regain his lost virility and waning creative powers. Narcisse and Nora, two orangutan-human hybrids from Nora's prequel, Oa, Roi de Singe, Oa, King of the Apes, are the other xenotransplant recipients. The two ape-human hybrids are surgically outfitted with human glands in a bid to, as one character says of Nora, transform the she-ape into a woman, thus accomplishing in a few months the work into which nature had put thousands of years. This is, in other words, a eugenic experiment to direct and accelerate the work of evolution through gland xenotransplantation. Narcisse and Nora's surgeries are not, however, symmetrical. Nora receives a full set of human glands. The more onerous procedure for her is a series of literally bone-breaking plastic surgeries, including ape bone inserts, that give her the silhouette of a fashionable 1920s woman. Nora's flesh is then cultured by placing a chimpanzee testicle within a mold of an idealized woman's figure. Ape testicles are here imagined to have the generative properties of pluripotent stem cells, underlining the fact that the glandular moment, in its obsession with finding and controlling the source of bodily plasticity, was a precursor to contemporary efforts to harness stem cell plasticity. For Narcisse, by contrast, the focus is on intellectual development. 2 human pineal glands and 2 thyroids are grafted into his brain with the intention of making him into a superhuman. Narcisse's transplants are intended less to retrace the path of evolution from ape to human than to activate his organic plasticity in order to hyper-accelerate evolution beyond what is imagined to be its current human peak. With Narcisse, eugenic gland xenotransplantation reaches toward what Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's lesser-known brother, would term transhumanism in 1957. Transhumanism names, for Huxley, the human species' savant use of eugenic measures to transcend itself, leading to a new stage of evolution beyond the human. Transhuman though he may be, Narcisse's physical appearance as an orangutan is left unaltered. As with gland transplantation practices in general, gland grafts and plastic surgeries are here orchestrated to reinforce a particular version of sexual difference. Narcisse represents an ideal fusion of cultivated white manhood and virile masculinity. Though intelligent, Nora is no match for the male geniuses that stud this novel. Instead, she represents one male fantasy of the ideal woman as a magnificent animal of pleasure, pornotropically responding to the sexual advances of any and every man, woman, and ape. Implicitly, the novel asks who is superior, the human man enhanced with ape testicular grafts, or the orangutan enhanced with human gland transplants. The novel's conclusion seems to fall resoundingly on the side of the enhanced ape. When Narcisse and Nora finally have sex, Nora finds that he is the only male able to fully satisfy her animal appetites. Soon thereafter, Ernest, revitalized after his ape graft surgery, returns to discover Narcisse and Nora in what appears to be a human simian embrace, since Nora has a human appearance. Aroused by the sight, he throws himself on Nora, whom he had been grooming to be his mistress, like a beastly rapist with a savage animal sensuality. Narcisse promptly breaks his neck. Revitalized white men, the novel concludes, are just as beastly, if not more so, as enhanced apes. They remain, nonetheless, physically weaker and less sexually virile. Could this strange narrative be read as an illustration of transplasticity that, by placing apes and humans within the same bimaterial fold, effecting a series of exchanges of matter between them, and playing on the erotic attractions that result, destroys ontological boundaries between human and ape? What would happen to this reading if we consider the difference race makes in transing the human-animal divide? Figures of blackness permeate the novel's attempts to illustrate species difference. Nora's first appearance reprises Josephine Baker's sensational banana skirt dance in her 1925 performance with the Revue Negre at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. The novel's spectators' lust and awe at Nora's animal sensuality are thus made equivalent to the response of Parisian spectators to Baker's fantasized black sexuality. Indeed, the tropes of sexual insatiability and thus unrapeability, of svelte animality, of childlike naivety, and of sexual experience unobtainable with white women that characterize Nora are precisely those that compose the French negrophilic porno trope of black femininity during the Jazz Age. Nor was Champsar the first to make such offensive parallels between Baker and an ape. Sexually suggestive animalizing descriptions were among the stock tropes of Baker's French reception. Gushing over Baker, for instance, dance critic Andre Levinson evoked an extraordinary creature of simian suppleness, a sinuous idol that enslaves and incites mankind. He described the finale, Baker's pas de deux with Martinican Joe Alex, titled Danse du Sauvage, as emanating a wild splendor and ferocious animality. Baker critics Meiji Henderson and Daphne Brooks have argued that Baker's irony, use of comedy, and savvy fusion of the French imaginary of black primitivity with the transatlantic modernist styles of American jazz and French music hall constitute forms of agency and resistance. As Henderson notes, however, white French critics and impresarios preferred to interpret and market Baker's virtuoso modernist dance performances as artless expressions of her primitive nature. Likewise, Champsar describes Nora's Danse Sauvage as the irresistible emanation of her animal nature. The dance has nothing learned, nothing imposed, and seems instead to be the frolicking of a young animal amusing herself without worrying about anything whatsoever. The character of Nora literalizes the ape and animal metaphors that were frequently used, often in eroticized and putatively positive contexts, to describe Baker. So dense is the traffic between Nora's animality and French figures of blackness that more than one critic misreads Nora as black. This is contrary to repeated descriptions in the novel of Nora as white, or even blue-skinned beneath her makeup, to her nickname La Bête Blanche, or the White Beast, and to the fact that she was born of a white, though likely Jewish, father. As with a generation of literary critics who conflated Tarzan's apes with its African savages, however, Nora's actual skin color may not ultimately matter for these critics. Brett Berliner, for example, reads Champsar's apes in general as transparent figures for blackness in order to condemn his novels as racist portrayals of the threat of miscegenation. In this reading, Nora's orangutan origins are evacuated of any animal specificity. Simian animality is nothing but a caricature of blackness. Such readings illustrate how human-simian figural crossings have become instantly recognizable as blatant icons of racism, to the point that all other possible interpretations are blotted out, even in the presence of evidence, Nora's whiteness, to the contrary. I would argue, however, that the novel's keen interest in the potential scientific basis of human-ape xenotransplantation brings human and ape biomateriality, not merely figuration, into play. Nevertheless, as the parallels between the fictionalized character Nora and Baker's actual reception demonstrate, human-simian crossings, whether figural or material, cannot be read apart from the historic Euro-North American association of race with animality. The next section works through what the confused complication of race and species in Nora can tell us about the uses of transplasticity. Theorizing animality with race. What does transplasticity do? First and foremost, gland transplantations were wielded as means of activating and directing bodily and species plasticity with a view to eugenic improvements. The science and speculative fiction of gland transplantation thus demand a rethinking of eugenics itself. Eugenics comprises more than efforts to shape racial stock through positive and negative controls over reproduction, and more even than efforts to perform Lamarckian or glandular alterations on plastic bodies and minds that might then be passed down through the generations. Beyond efforts to shape the race and the species by either targeting reproduction or altering the bodies of current generations, eugenics might be more broadly defined as an effort to modulate the temporality of racial and species evolution. In the late 19th, 1800s, and early 20th, 1900s centuries, Darwinists reordered the globe into one continuous secular order of being, divided and hierarchized into race and species as avatars of progress or regress, movement or temporal lag. In monogenetic interpretations of Darwinism that held all humans to be descended from a common ancestor, there was no absolute difference between the races, just as there was no absolute divide between humans and apes. Rather than absolute differences of kind, race and species were but temporary figures wrought out of the moving arc of evolution. Nora speculatively envisions a version of eugenics that seeks, through gland transplantation, to radically accelerate evolutionary change, activating the species plasticity of the orangutan body until it achieves human or, in Narcissus' case, transhuman characteristics. In so doing, Nora reminds us that, as scholars such as Jana Brown, Kyla Scheller, and Jules Gill-Peterson have argued, the source of speculative and scientific interest in plasticity was eugenics. New materialist enthusiasm about the dynamism and vitality of organic matter must contend with this eugenic and racist history of plasticity, as well as the potential eugenic and human engineering uses to which contemporary technologies of plasticity, such as genetic modification and stem cell technologies, may still be put. The bone-crunching surgeries, surgical suturing of organs and parts from different species, and tissue cultures used to change Nora's form from ape to human are reminiscent of H.G. Wells' 1896 classic, The Island of Dr. Moreau, with which Champsar was likely familiar. Nora's similarities with, and, more to the point, its generic departures from Dr. Moreau offer conceptual insights into the relations among animality, sex, and race. Dr. Moreau's plot is well known. On a remote Pacific island, the eponymous Moreau pushes the art of vivisection to extremes, performing excruciatingly painful surgeries on non-human animals of a range of species until they approximate the human form. His explicit ambition is to find out the extreme limit of plasticity in a living shape. Colonialism is the enabling condition of this early scientific inquiry into organic plasticity. After being chased out of Britain by humane resistance to the cruelty of his non-human animal vivisection experiments, Moreau, in a settler colonial gesture, claims an entire island as his laboratory, where he reigns unsupervised as absolute sovereign. Moreau creates his loyal subjects, which he names the Beast People, fashions his own law, which he forces the Beast People to recite, and profits from the primitive accumulation of a wealth of non-human animal biomatter for his experiments. As in Nora, technologically produced humanoid animals are relentlessly racialized. Of his first vivisection success, a gorilla, Moreau relates, "I thought him a fair specimen of the negroid type when I had done him." Confronted with these frighteningly beastly humanoid creatures, the shipwrecked narrator, Edward Prendick, repeatedly wonders what race of human savages they might be. Within European-authored ontologies of species and race, an animalized human or humanized animal occupies the same position as the native of color. Hence, within science fiction, such figures continually reference and counter-reference each other. The fact that surgical recombinations of human and non-human animal evoke racial tropes reveals something about the ontology of race. Race was conceptually generated through transings of human and animal. 19th, 1800s, and 20th century 1900s experiments in trans-species plasticity resonated with the older discourses of natural history, which we might recast as preoccupied with the species plasticity of non-white natives and apes. If natives of color and apes were the descendants of human-beast matings, then they exemplified species plasticity, two species hybridizing, their biological material fusing to create a new type of being. Thus, species plasticity buttressed emergent racial and species taxonomies, helping classify racialized natives, particularly Africans and Hottentots, as lower forms of humanity. By the 20th century, 1900s, such origin stories either were forgotten or lacked credibility. The ontology of race as a transing of human and animal was nevertheless replayed in unrealized Darwin-inspired schemes for hybridization experiments. In the early 20th century, 1900s, evolutionary expert Ernst Haeckel and German sexologist Hermann Rodler each proposed, unrelated, hybridization experiments between humans and apes. Haeckel thought that the sperm of an African man was necessary for the experiment to succeed, and Rodler recommended the sperm of a mixed-race native of Tenerife. In the 17th, 1600s, and 18th, 1700s centuries, transplasticity, in the form of reproduction across species difference, generated ontology, furnishing the evidence that buttressed Euro-humanist racial taxonomies of being. By the 20th century, 1900s, this forgotten history haunted speculative proposals to test the transplasticity of humans of color, thought to be evolutionarily closer to apes than were white humans, by attempting to hybridize them with apes. In the racial sciences of the 17th, 1600s through 20th, 1900s centuries, race either was animality itself or was a transing of animality and humanity, the animal within the human, or tranimality, if you will. Material transings generated humanist hierarchies of being. Transplasticity produced the ontology of race and species. Hence, Nora's inquiries into species plasticity, its material recombinations of human and non-human animal, and experiments in accelerating orangutan evolution are ultimately powerless against this genealogy of race and species. Nora's play with ape-human xenotransplantation ends up evoking, over and over, figures of surplus animal sexual vitality, Nora's hypersexuality, Narcissus' superior penis. In turn, these figures of animal sexuality cannot but replay the ontology of race as a transing of humanity and animality. Transing is an ineffective means of throwing Darwinism's racial and species hierarchies into disarray, much less of dismantling racism along with speciesism, as some animal studies scholarship might hope. This is because race was already constituted through the transing of human and non-human animal in the first place. There is a historical lesson in this revelation. To think transing in the present, without the axis of time, allows scholars to imagine it as what transgressively entangles or destabilizes putatively fixed ontological categories, such as race and species. Restoring the axis of time, however, reveals that at one point these ontologies were emergent rather than fixed. During this moment of emergence, material transings, in their activation of organic plasticity, helped produce the ontobiological concepts of sex, race, and species difference. Attention to material transings through gland xenotransplantation, transgenic organisms, interspecies sex, and, more prosaically, the human consumption and digestion of animal and plant matter, can help conceptually unravel the fictions of the determinism and fixity of biology, the purity and self-sameness of organisms, and the exceptionality of the human. It is crucial, however, that in envisioning the conceptual potential of transplasticity, scholars not ignore its speculative and actual uses. This is not to oppose radical speculation to hard historical reality. Modern speculative fiction imagined a more perfect eugenics more often than it promoted radical alternatives to modern ontologies of being. Transplasticity has been both speculatively and actually conscripted into the service of eugenics, human engineering, and the use of non-human organisms as raw matter for the renewal of the human. The latter is all too clear, for example, in efforts to create, through transgenic gene splicing, a pig that can grow human organs to be harvested and transplanted into humans. Transing, in and of itself, is not the answer. What transplasticity calls for is a nuanced political analysis of the power relations, conceptual genealogies, and biopolitical economies brought into play when putatively distinct orders of being are materially combined.